If you've flown over, I don't know, the last 23 years or so, you might have noticed that it's a remarkably time consuming and involved process. And that is mainly due to the events of September 11th, 2001.
Mentioned we have a breaking news story to tell you about. Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City. It happened just a few moments ago, apparently. We have very little information available at this point in time, but on the phone.
Immediately after that, things kind of got silly. Military patrolled airports, while the dwindled customer trust meant that most planes around the U.S. weren't even traveling full, sometimes not even half full.
The morning rush ended abruptly at 8 a.m., and terminals usually packed with Monday morning travelers began to look empty again.
And even as restrictions slowly lifted and the military backed off, the experience of flying, almost globally, had drastically changed. But while this has settled into the normal day-to-day for people traveling by air, what was it like back before that fateful day? Well, air travel has had an interesting history, and 9/11 wasn't necessarily the turning point for getting rid of lax security. More like it was the final straw. More for just the cool story, let's go way back to the first ever commercial airline service. This was launched on January 1st, 1914, just 11 years after the first ever flight by the Orville brothers.
Okay, I know that it's the Wright brothers, but I had Orville Wright on the script and I went to say brothers, so I went with Orville instead of Wright. That one's on me, okay?
Now, the company was called the St. Petersburg to Tampa Airboat Line, and it was a 23-minute flight across the bay in Florida. And at the time, it was a massive deal since it shortened the trip by 90 minutes compared to boat and 11 and a half hours compared to train. And if somebody decided to go by car, the trip was around 20 hours. So 23-minute trip was kind of like warp speed. And the first person to get that experience, they got to pay through the nose for the convenience. You see, the first ticket was auctioned off to Abram C. File as part of this celebration to kick off the business. The cost of that ticket was $400. Now, in today's money, that equates to over $11,000. Don't worry though. Over the next 4 months, the plane did 2 flights a day, 6 days a week, and it cost $5 per person or $5 per 100 pounds of freight. That $5 today translates to about $140. So still better rates than you get today. Over the next couple decades, several airlines started popping up, but initially, the planes were all open air and hardly cost effective. By the early 30s, planes were closed up, but they weren't pressurized, meaning they had to fly at low altitudes. And it was a bit of a miserable experience. The worst part was that it was still ungodly expensive. A single ticket from coast to coast was around $260, around half the cost of a new car. Not to mention, trains and buses were still much cheaper and were very much established and offered comforts that planes could not. However, despite it being strictly for executives and the wealthy, this was a massive growth period for flight, seeing it grow from 6,000 passengers in 1929 to over 450,000 by 1934, and then 1.2 million by 1938. But even with numbers like that, it was still only a small sliver of the entire public that ever got to experience flight. But that all starts to change with World War II. Now, I get it, World War II was horrific in almost every way possible. But the reliance on flight during the conflict spurred on tons of aeronautic innovations, which led to regular passenger flights in the 1950s. And by 1955, airliners had replaced ocean liners as the preferred way of crossing the Atlantic. Business was absolutely booming, and there was literally zero security. This was considered the golden age of flying, and the experience was closer to fine dining than it was to cramped legroom. But at least the US got a wake-up call on November 1st, 1955, when United Airlines Flight 629 from Denver to Portland exploded just after takeoff, killing 44 people. The world stood still while investigators scoured through the wreckage to try to find the cause. And apparently it was rather easy for them to determine that it was caused by dynamite in a suitcase. Now, in case you're wondering, the culprit for this was Jack Gilbert Graham, the son of one of the passengers. Apparently, he had been implicated in numerous schemes in the years prior and had even purchased life insurance on his mother at the airport from a vending machine. Now, we're going to talk about why that's important in a bit. Let's just say air travel was rather risky back then. Anyways, Graham basically admitted to it right away and seemed rather unbothered by the fact that he had taken out 43 other people as well as his mother. The worst part about this, though, at the time, there was no actual law prohibiting what he had done, so he really couldn't be charged with much in regards to they did have him on at least one murder charge, and he was found guilty and sentenced to death, which was carried out only a year and a half later. But that wasn't necessarily the biggest issue facing air travel back in the day, though.
Good evening. The third hijacking in the Middle East this week, and this time it is an American plane. The last glimpse we had of TWA 847 was as it took off from Algiers almost 3 hours ago. It is present.
Hijacking was becoming a much bigger issue, but it took years for it to reach the US. Funnily enough, the first ever hijacking happened in 1919 in Hungary. The dubious honor goes to Baron Franz something? My Hungarian is super rusty. Anyways, he was trying to escape the very short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic, but, for some reason at the time, couldn't secure a passport. So he forged some military documents, convinced a commander at a Hungarian airfield to get him up in the air with a pilot, and once there, Franz took out a gun and instructed the pilot to land in Vienna, and well, that was that. However, hijacking wasn't always so civil. Between the 1920s and 1950s, hijacking became a popular way to influence politics or avoid certain politics, and the odd time, just to complete some nefarious criminal plot. And sadly, more often than not, the hijacking of an aircraft actually ended with some sort of loss of life. By the way, the first ever US airliner that was hijacked was on May 1st, 1961. It was a flight from Marathon, Florida to Key West, and the hijacker demanded to be flown to Cuba. That incident did actually land safely and no one was injured, but that was actually just the beginning. It was almost becoming trendy. Between 1961 and 1968, there were only 9 hijackings of American commercial flights. However, over the next 4 years, from 68 to 1972, there were more than 130, and at times, there was more than one per day. This was the golden age of hijacking, and really, that all comes down to the lack of security. Now, sadly, most of that blame is on the actual airports who were worried that metal detectors might put off potential flyers. The FAA even started up a Sky Marshal program to help out, but they were only ever called in for flights that were considered high priority. Specifically, air marshals were only called in when airlines or the FBI insisted, which again, wasn't that often. So then around this time, training started to ramp up, requiring ticket agents to flag suspicious people, but that never really worked out either. In fact, it wasn't until 1973 that those aforementioned metal detectors and mandatory x-rays in searches of carry-ons became a normal experience before flying. And even then, it still didn't completely stop the hijackings.
And they've managed to sneak guns and grenades through the Athens airport security.
However, over the subsequent years, combined with better police responses and better training for emergency services, it was becoming less of a profitable crime. However, it does still happen from time to time, though in the 2020s, there's only been 3 incidents. Over the next couple years, for the most part, there was no real push to clamp down with security. It was still seen as a major deterrent for prospective flyers. So, while hijackings continued, it was considered a bit of a rarity and security would get pretty relaxed. You couldn't just go from ticket to plane anymore, but security was basically just causing lineups, so while it did work to some degree, it wasn't exactly a standardized process, and as long as you didn't try getting on the plane with a gun in your belt, well, you're okay to just pass through. And realistically, there really was no precedent other than the occasional hijacking. People weren't dying in droves, and while the odd one did end tragically, it was, for the most part, a minor inconvenience for airlines. They just often gave in to the demands and waited out the experience or until the hijacker was arrested. And while it might sound stupid today, in the minds of the airlines, there was more to lose by clamping down with harsh security than there was letting the odd person take over an aircraft. But sadly, that complacency allowed for the upcoming weaponization of aircraft, like the world has never seen.
And as for the nation's two busiest airports, Chicago's O'Hare and Atlanta's Hartsfield, both are open, of course, with limited flights.
Now, perhaps a few words about how the traveling experience has changed post 9/11. Initially, everything clamped down, and honestly, at the time, it wasn't as big of a change as people thought because, frankly, no one was flying. And can you blame them? One of the things people seem to forget about that time was the constant barrage from media about the threat levels of more terrorism going to be happening at any given time. If you turned on any channel, it was just around the corner. It could happen at any minute. We went from a society that was unconcerned to a hyper-vigilant state almost overnight. The numbers, they were initially pretty bleak. Passenger volume dropped 6% across the board and 9% when departing from the busiest airports. Now, while some believe this was just a response to the fears, some economists actually believe it was a direct but unintended consequence to the increased screening and scrutiny, which sadly was the biggest fear from the airlines this whole time. All in all, in the downturn of business after 9/11, the airlines lost $8 billion in 2001 alone. And may I remind you, the attacks happened in the final quarter of that year. It wasn't until 2006 that airlines began making money again, and it's believed that the total financial loss in those 5 years was over $60 billion. Before you go, there's a couple interesting tidbits that didn't necessarily fit into this video. So a lot of people complain about how flying isn't what it used to be and kind of want to go back to the luxury of the golden age of flying. Be careful with what you wish. Even without considering the extreme cost at the time, it was also way more dangerous to fly. In the 50s and 60s, US airlines suffered at least 6 crashes per year, and as the industry and technology grew, that danger only got worse into the 70s. In fact, it was so bad that life insurance was still being sold at airports well into the 80s. Comparatively, it's now safer to fly than it is to take a train. And finally, while it may sound absurd, smoking on airplanes used to be not only allowed, but it was encouraged and featured as part of their marketing. However, while the world continued to smoke indoors well into the 2000s, planes were quick to butt out the practice as early as the 70s. Most companies made small changes like smoking sections, but then moved on to banning smoking from short flights. It wasn't until the year 2000 that it was banned in the US on all domestic and international flights. However, pilots were still able to smoke after that as there were concerns, though it didn't last long. And most countries were banning it around the same time, if not earlier. 2 countries, however, held on to the practice for some time, though. Cuba's state-owned Cubana airline didn't ban smoking on international flights until 2014. Taking the cake, however, is China, who banned smoking on all flights by 1995, but allowed pilots to smoke in the cockpit, which they tried banning in 2017, but because of a few incidents, they scrapped the ban completely. Well, the pilots still smoke. Thanks for watching.